Saturday, May 30th, 2020, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today I want to talk about the day the Bank of England allowed Hitler to steal Czechoslovakia's gold. I'm going to reference The Tower of Basel by Adam Libor. For that, before I go into the story, I want to touch upon a current event that's happening in relation to the Bank of England, and it's Venezuela suing the Bank of England over the Bank of England's refusal to release its gold. So let's first go through the story. And many people think that this case could be very important because if the court in England finds that the Bank of England is not doing anything wrong and doesn't allow Venezuela to have its gold, it could cause problems in the gold market. It could lead to other countries who have thousands of tons of gold with the Bank of England to maybe think about withdrawing that gold from there. We know from investigating and researching COMEX and the LBMA in London how a lot of that gold is probably used to manipulate the market through leasing into the LBMA by the Bank of England. So it could be a significant story as far as the gold price is concerned. So let's go through the story here. It says, lawyer says UK central bank has moral imperative to help ease effects of the virus. Venezuela has filed a $1 billion lawsuit against the Bank of England over its refusal to release gold stashed in its vaults as the government of Nicolas Maduro scrambles for funds to alleviate a deepening economic and health crisis. Caracas has used the BOE for decades to store bullion that makes up part of its central bank reserves. It tried in late 2018 to get access to the gold, but the BOE refused. The British government, along with about 60 others worldwide, does not recognize Mr. Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate leader, arguing that he rigged the last presidential election 2 years ago. So before I go further, I like to show you a list of the current permanent representatives to the United Nations. And if you scroll down to Venezuela, the guy's name is Samuel Moncada Acosta. And if you look at Mr. Acosta, he's been nominated, he's been put there by President Nicolas Maduro. So the United Nations recognizes the government of Nicolas Maduro. They've accepted his representative at the UN. So I would say the Bank of England doesn't have a leg to stand on if the United Nations recognizes the government of Nicolas Maduro. Am I defending Nicolas Maduro? No, but we need to draw a line legally, I would say, or at least in international law. What the Bank of England is doing, in my opinion, is political. So let's keep going. In its latest claim, Venezuela's central bank, BCV, has switched tack, saying that funds from the sale of the gold will be routed to the United Nations Development Program so that it can be used by the agency to combat the virus by buying healthcare equipment and medicines. In a claim form filed to London's High Court, BCV is seeking a court order to transfer 930 million euros or $1 billion of the value of the gold held by the BOE. There is no sufficient basis for such refusal, the lawsuit claims, adding that the BOE's conduct is wrongful. According to the claim form, the UK Central Bank's actions are depriving BCV of access to its gold reserves at a time of national and global emergency, and so preventing BCV and UNDP from addressing the emergency. The BOE on Wednesday said it did not comment on individual customer relationships. The UK central bank holds about 400,000 bars of gold worth $200 billion and is the second largest custodian of gold in the world after the New York Federal Reserve, according to the BOE website. So I'll stop at that. Let's go to the BOE's website. It says how much gold is kept in the Bank of England. So they say 400,000 bars. Those bars are approximately 12 kilos each, or 400 ounces. So worth about $200 billion at current prices, I guess. I think it's just under 5,000 metric tons. The interesting thing, though, that the Bank of England says here in this website, and I'll read for you. No gold has ever been stolen from the bank in over 320 years of history. However, there is a story that suggests that the bank had a lucky escape in Victorian times. And they go over this guy who worked in the sewage underneath the bank in 1836, and he found an entrance to the vault. And he actually informed the directors, and he proved to them that he could get to the vault, and they actually rewarded him with 800 pounds at the time, which was a lot of money, of course. But my argument is that there has been gold stolen at the Bank of England. It might not have left the Bank of England, but one of their customers had their gold stolen. And that's where we come to Czechoslovakia and the Tower of Basel. This is a book about the Bank for International Settlements. And this is the day or the year when the Bank of England actually allowed the government of Nazi Germany to steal Czechoslovakia's gold. So the Bank of England, of course, did not mention that incident. I guess it's not good PR, but it is the truth. So let's go over this interesting period in the Bank of England's history when it actually allowed Hitler to plunder Czechoslovak gold. So it's in Chapter 5, an authorized plunder. And this is a quote from a Labour MP, George Strauss, at the time speaking in the House of Commons in May 1939. And I quote, "The Bank for International Settlements is the bank which sanctions the most notorious outrage of this generation, the rape of Czechoslovakia." And the Bank of England, as you will see, was involved in this so-called rape of Czechoslovakia. So let's dig into the story. When Nazi Germany annexed Czechoslovak border province of the Sudetenland in September 1938, it immediately absorbed a good part of the country's banking system, as well as most of Czechoslovakia's strategic defenses. By then, the country's national bank had prudently, they thought, I guess, transferred most of its gold abroad to two accounts at the Bank of England, one in the name of the BIS and one in the name of the National Bank of Czechoslovakia itself. Countries had deposited some of their gold reserves in a sub-account at the BIS account in London to ease gold sales and purchases. Of the 94,772 kilograms of gold, only 6,337 kilograms remained in Prague. The security of the national gold was more than a monetary issue. The Czechoslovak reserves, like those of Republican Spain, were an expression of nationhood, carved out of the remains of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918. The Czechoslovak Republic was a new and fragile nation. A good part of the gold had been donated by the public in the country's early years. Joseph Malik, the governor of the National Bank, and his fellow Czechs believed that even as the Nazis dismembered their homeland, if the national gold was safe, then something of the country's independence would endure. They were wrong. The Czechoslovaks' faith in the probity of the BIS and the Bank of England was tragically misplaced. The gold was sacrificed with barely a second thought to the needs of transnational finance and the Third Reich. The Nazis' first demand came in February 1939 when Berlin ordered Prague to transfer just over 14.5 metric tons of gold, supposedly to back the German currency now circulating in the Sudetenland. This was certainly an innovative idea. First invade a neighboring country, annex part of it, and then demand the newly truncated state supply the gold to pay for the loss of its territory. The following month, the question became academic. On March 15th, the Wehrmacht marched into Prague. The German protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was declared, and Czechoslovakia no longer existed. But the gold reserves did. 3 days later, a Reichsbank official was dispatched to the National Bank of Czechoslovakia and ordered the directors, under the threat of death, to issue 2 orders. Thanks to diligent detective work by Pete Clemens, the BIS archivist, we have a clear picture of what happened next. The first order instructed the BIS to transfer 23.1 metric tons of Czechoslovak gold held at the BIS accounts at the Bank of England to the Reichsbank BIS accounts also held at the Bank of England. So Hitler actually had gold at the Bank of England in 1939. The second order instructed the Bank of England to transfer almost 27 metric tons of gold held in the National Bank of Czechoslovakia's own accounts to the BIS's gold accounts at the Bank of England. So Czechoslovakia had 2 accounts at the Bank of England. One, a direct account, National Bank of Czechoslovakia account, where they had 27 tons. And the other one, they held the gold at the Bank of England, but it was in a sub-account with the BIS, 23.1 metric tons. This is important to understand as we go further in the story. Malik and his fellow directors hoped that it would be obvious that the instructions had been issued under duress and so would not be implemented. The Nazis had just invaded Czechoslovakia and would obviously target the national gold reserves, but Malik had not reckoned on Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, had no interest whether Czechoslovakia was free or a Nazi colony. Political considerations must not affect the BIS's transactions. The transfer order, he said, must go through. So there you go. The Bank of England back then didn't make it political. They said, oh, it must go through. But I would say they should have stopped it because it wasn't lawful, I would say, what the Germans did. They invaded another country. They held a gun to a central banker's head and told him to transfer the gold. I would say Venezuela is in the right at the moment. If you believe in the UN, of course. I know a lot of you and even me don't rate the UN, but be as it may, the UN is the institution that recognizes countries. I still think the UK is part of the UN, and it's even one of the permanent members of the Security Council, right? So let's keep going. Meanwhile, in Basel, Johan Bayen, the Dutch president of the BIS, wavered. Bayen discussed the matter with the BIS's legal advisor, Felix Weiser. But like Norman, Weiser took the most formalistic approach possible. As long as the paperwork was in order, the monies must go through. Weiser argued somewhat bizarrely that there could be no legal grounds to claim that the transfer order had been issued under duress, as such a plea could be brought before a Swiss court only by the persons who had acted under duress. Clearly, the directors of the National Bank of Czechoslovakia were unlikely to travel to Switzerland to present their case. Therefore, any decision not to authorize the transfer would be one of BIS policy rather than administration. The board of the BIS made policy. Thus, Bayen would have to consult the board to stop payment. This was poor advice for another reason. Under the terms of the BIS statutes, the Swiss authorities anyway had no jurisdiction over gold transfers between states, and he's right, because the BIS is not part of Switzerland. Even though it's physically in Switzerland, it's like a sovereign entity. Bayern was unwilling to take a decision without authorization, but who could he ask? The chairman of the BIS board, Sir Otto Niemeyer, of the Bank of England, was traveling to Egypt, and so was incommunicado. At 6 p.m. on March 20th, Roger O'Boyne, the bank's general manager, told Bayern that the governor of the Bank of France had discussed the matter with London. The Bank of England and the Bank of France would not be taking any action to stop the transfer because they felt that there were no grounds for action. The BIS transfer order went through. With London, Paris, and Basel's compliance, Nazi Germany had just looted 23.1 metric tons of gold without a shot being fired. More than 2/3 of that gold was traded with the Dutch and Belgian national banks and was eventually transported from Amsterdam and Brussels to the Reichsbank's vaults in Berlin. So when the Bank of England website says that there's never been any gold stolen from the Bank of England, maybe it might be right in a physical sense, but it's not true in the sense that one of their clients or customers had their gold stolen, and that was Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia's diligent planning to safeguard its national gold reserves, together with its misplaced faith in the integrity of the new international financial system, had come to nothing. And I would say that nothing's changed. You can't trust the bankers still to this day. The second transfer order for the 27 metric tons held in the National Bank of Czechoslovakia's own account at the Bank of England did not go through. So the Nazis didn't get the 27 tons from the National Bank of Czechoslovakia's own account at the Bank of England. So at least they were protected in that sense. Sir John Simon, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, had instructed banks to block all Czechoslovak assets. But Czechoslovak gold held in the BIS account at the Bank of England, it seemed, was not defined as a national asset and was beyond the reach of UK laws. So that's how they got around it. The Bank of England said, well, it's not Czechoslovak gold, it's BIS gold. But they knew that it was Czechoslovak gold with the BIS. Norman and Bayern's decision caused despair and incomprehension in Prague and uproar in London. The loss of Czechoslovak gold was all Norman's fault, exclaimed the Daily Herald. Paul Einzig of the Financial News ran a stream of stories exposing the complicity of both the Treasury and the Bank of England in the affair. Einzig demanded to know why the Treasury had not stopped the transfer, as it was a clear violation of the law known as the Czechoslovakia Act. Brendan Bracken, a journalist and ally of Winston Churchill, declared in the House of Commons that, and I quote, the Bank of England, after what has happened, may no longer be looked on as the safest place in the world. And the phrase, safe as the Bank of England, may no longer apply. Churchill himself demanded to know how the government could urge people to enlist in the military when it was, and I quote, so butterfingered that 6 million pounds of gold can be transferred to the Nazi government. So there you go. It will be interesting to see what this court in London decides in this case of the Venezuelan gold. As you can see, the Bank of England's past is a checkered past, and it continues to be, I would say, an institution that I personally would not trust if I were a leader of a government or a country. I would make sure that that central bank would not keep its gold at the Bank of England. It's not safe. You can see how they've acted back in 1939 and how they're acting now, even towards a country that is recognized, or a government that is recognized by the United Nations. They're not allowing this country to have its gold. And I think they should lose this case. But if the court decides against Venezuela in favor of the Bank of England, we need to keep an eye on things in terms of what other countries decide to do. There is a lot of physical gold vaults of the Bank of England, almost 5,000 tons. So should countries really continue to trust the Bank of England? I don't think so, and I've been saying this for years. I mean, Australia keeps 80 tons or most of its gold with the Bank of England. There hasn't been any independent audit there. I recommend you watch John Adams' videos about this case as well. The RBA, I think, is doing the wrong thing, keeping Australia's gold at the Bank of England. I'll put a link below to John Adams' videos, and also up in the card about the Bank of England and the Aussie gold. So there you go. Don't believe everything you read in the Bank of England's website. They forgot to tell you that actually there has been gold stolen at the Bank of England back in 1939. And it was actually stolen by Adolf Hitler. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. Please share it far and wide. Think about subscribing to my channel if you haven't yet. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and all these other platforms below here. I wish you all a great weekend. Take care. Bye.